Rita, you were astonished by the response from those who lost the yes, the voice referendum a year ago next weekend or the weekend after, and they're still licking their wounds. They're still coming out and pretending that they didn't lose.
In denial, completely blind to their own faults. An extraordinary, extensive piece in The Australian with the voice architects and chief promoters basically saying they were invisible and swept under the table and that's why they lost. No, you lost because you were not invisible. You did enormous harm to the yes cause. And I would argue that the biggest... the biggest motivators for people voting no were the yes camp. It wasn't necessarily the no
yes.
arguments that had so much cut through. It was listening to the yes camp. It was the fact that they did get an enormous platform, most of it uncritical, just allowed to push their divisive agenda, and Australians did not like it. And almost a year later, they seem to be completely in denial about what happened. They think there was some sort of people were hoodwinked. We weren't hoodwinked. We saw what happened. Your campaign not only had enormous institutional support, every corporation, every sporting organisation, the celebrity world, the culture, everyone was backing it. Huge funding, the money the Yes camp had to push their agenda. The No camp could not compete with it. They couldn't even run proper campaigns in places like Melbourne and Sydney because ads were so expensive. And yet every single state said no. And that message isn't being listened to. It seems like they are finding all sorts of mad rationalisations for what happened rather than just accepting. Australians don't want to be divided by race. We don't want to have racial privilege, racial division enshrined in our constitution. We don't want it in the law. We don't want it anywhere. And I think that's, again, why we're seeing this, people actually taking a stand. And I know we're going to be talking to a barrister later about the acknowledgement of countries that are shoved down our throats at every meeting, at every event, sometimes multiple times, every time a plane lands. Enough. We don't want it. It doesn't bring us together. It separates us. It's insulting to many Australians. And people are finally feeling entitled to actually say what they think rather than being cowed into silence.
Well, you're right, Rita, and the Yes campaign turned people away for the simple fact that you couldn't move throughout most of the suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne without tripping over Yes signs and all the rest, which ended up in the recycling bins the next day after the vote. But the reality was that the Yes campaign went all out. This is a great moral thing. We're all going to do this. Oh, we're going to have treaty and we're going to have truth-telling. And there was all sorts of moral pressure put on people. Oh, you know, said Marsha Langton, I think it was her, if you vote no to this, we're not going to do any more welcomes to country.
What happened to that
That'll learn you. Yeah,
well, it did.
And people
Marsha,
went,
please.
exactly, people went, you beauty. Yes, that'll be a no then, you beauty. And now, this is why it is so important. We'll be talking to Lana Kalaris, as Rita said in a tick. She's the barrister who's brave enough to stand up in the workplace at the Victorian Bar and say, I'm sorry, if we're going to do a welcome or acknowledgement, we do it to all Australians. We don't do it to just one race or one small group of Australians. Very brave woman. We need more people who are prepared to stand up in the workplace politely, respectfully, and say, I'm sorry, we voted no to dividing Australia by race. Welcome to country, and particularly acknowledgement of country. Both those things divide us further and further by race. They're just doing the voice by stealth, and it's up to the citizenry to stand up and say, I'm sorry, we voted against this, so we won't be participating in this particular event. And it's critical that corporate Australia gets behind recognising the harm they did by jumping onto it, as Rita said, turning away customers, and more importantly, the coalition has to go to the next election with a very clear policy to reduce welcome to countries, reduce acknowledgement to country, and reduce the use of the Aboriginal flag other than on critical, important, proper ceremonious occasions, not this ubiquitous, whenever we happen to see anything, we're going to do a welcome to.
Well, anytime you see any member of the Labor government these days speaking where they're in their offices, it's not the Australian flag behind them, it's the Australian flag plus two other flags. Now, we are one country.
Exactly.
The Australian flag represents every Australian, whether you were born here, whether you're a migrant, whether you have ancestry that is Indigenous. it represents every single person. And I think this identity politics is so poisonous. Australians rejected it, and the government needs to listen to that rejection. They cannot continue to ignore it, and both state and the federal government have ignored it. We've got so much... we've got states doing treaties on their own.
And we've got the New South Wales government talking about doing some kind of exploration. They're spending millions of dollars going around to explore treaties and all this. We said no. The Australian people said no. And if our politicians don't understand this, they've got to learn the hard way. They've got to learn at the ballot box that they're out if they carry on with this nonsense.
That can only come if the coalition give them a choice.
100%.
I can tell you in Victoria, at the last state election, the hapless Victorian Libs, they were for treaty.
Exactly.
So the Victorians had no choice if you were cared about this issue. But on every other significant issue, the Victorian Libs were also pretty much on board with Labor. I think people look at a place like Victoria and wonder how it could get so bad. How can you have such an enormous state debt? How can you have a state that seems so broken? Well, when people don't have a choice, that's what happens.
Absolutely.
You have to give them the choice.